Hello, good evening. This is Al24 News. I'm Brahim Kashur and to the headlines. Minister of Europe and Foreign Affairs of French Republic, Jean-Yves Le Drian, has started a working visit to Algeria this morning to discuss bilateral relations. In our News 5, we will be discussing with our political expert the rising tension between Russia and Ukraine, a high-stakes virtual conference between President Vladimir Putin and his US counterpart Joe Biden. Australian government follows the same footsteps of the United States and New Zealand in boycotting the next Olympic Games held in China. And finally, a Malaysian appeals court upheld former Prime Minister Najib Razak guilty verdict in case linked to a corruption scandal. First in our top stories, the Minister of Europe and Foreign Affairs of the French Republic, Jean-Yves Le Drian, has started a working visit to Algeria this morning to discuss bilateral relations. He was received by his Algerian counterpart, Mtala Mamra, the Foreign Affairs Minister, here in Algeria. This visit comes after an unprecedented diplomatic arguments between the two countries.
Exprimé le souhait de travailler à lever les blocages et les malentendus qui peuvent exister.
I have expressed the wish to work in order to correct the misunderstanding that may exist between our two countries. We have agreed to resume some cooperation. This will be through a resumption of an operational dialogue between partners pertaining to humanitarian and migratory issues. We hope that the dialogue that we restarted today will lead to a resumption of political exchanges between our governments in 2022. Beyond the wounds of the past, we must look for the future. I hope that our two countries resume together peace relations and could look toward the future.
D'une relation apaisée et puisse regarder vers l'avenir. La reprise d'un dialogue.
The resumption of a practical and operational dialogue on the fight against terrorism so as to fight against the scourge on common grounds for the security of our two countries. We also evoke the security situation in the Sahel and the pivotal role that Algeria is playing in the peace process of Mali. I seize the opportunity to hail Algeria's efforts.
Se poursuivent sur ce sujet.
To the hot potato nowadays, Russian President Vladimir Putin and his US counterpart Joe Biden held a 2-hour high-stakes virtual conference today in which they discussed the rising tension between Russia and Ukraine that have stirred fears of possible wars. Zara Forjani on this photo.
Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin held a virtual summit that lasted roughly 2 hours in hopes of easing tensions between Russia and Ukraine. According to the White House's readout of the conversation, Biden shared deep concerns about Russia's increased troop presence along the country's border with Ukraine, which has sparked fears of a potential invasion. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan at U.S. press briefing said Biden urged Putin to embrace de-escalation and diplomacy towards Ukraine.
And we believe that we are seeing a common threat picture here, and our message to our friends in the Ukrainian government, as our message was today to President Putin, is that the United States supports the Minsk process, wants to see progress made towards a ceasefire, towards confidence-building measures, and that is the best way forward. There is a tasking coming out of that meeting by the two presidents to their teams to start talking about how we might think about the diplomatic path. The President made clear throughout that diplomacy has to come in the context of de-escalation rather than escalation, and now we will watch what unfolds in the coming days.
The two presidents tasked their team to follow up, and the U.S. will do so in close coordination with allies and partners. Russia's spokesman Dmitry Peskov is now claiming Russia has no plans to attack nor invade Ukraine. However, what counts is whether troops and tanks back away. Usually, important meetings between leaders deliver at least a few minor agreements, but this call might not if Biden hangs tough.
Ukraine Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov warned that Russian invasion of Ukraine would mean a truly bloody massacre. Moscow in turn demanded a guarantee from Kiev not to attack the regions in the far east of the country, known collectively as Donbass, which are controlled by pro-Russian separatists. Hassan Brakan.
Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov has stated that there will be a really bloody massacre if Russia decides to invade Ukraine, and warned that Russian guys also will come back in the coffins, amid higher alarm about troop movements on the nation's borders.
I will not believe that Russia will have a victory in Ukraine. It's a different, because it will be a really bloody massacre. And Russian guys also will come back in the coffins, yes.
For its part, Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin spokesperson, stated that rhetoric from the West is hostile and that Russian position is clear and need to start negotiating guarantees with the West.
There is a certain crisis situation with Ukraine. We see aggressive and hostile rhetoric coming from the European capitals and Washington. Putin has an absolutely clearly formulated position. He has spoken about the need to start negotiating on a system of guarantee.
This comes after Biden and Putin had a video call of 2 hours in an attempt to de-escalate the tensions between Russia and Ukraine.
And to grasp the topic in better manner, I'm joined live by Dr. Hamoud Salhi, Professor and Associate Dean of International Education from California, USA. First of all, Dr. Hamoud, face-to-face for over 2 hours, U.S. President Joe Biden and Russia's Vladimir Putin squared off in a secure video call to notice that an invasion of Ukraine would bring sanctions and enormous harm to Russian economy. What are the outcomes of this online call between U.S. and Russian presidents? Do you think this online video will surely bring the crisis to an end, or this is just another political show of power?
Thank you again for inviting me. There are two sides to this story. Let me get you back to the same situation in April of this year, where the Russian president and President Biden and the American president met to discuss at that time what the Ukrainian crisis. We were in the same situation. At that meeting, President Biden suggested that they will meet at a different time later on to discuss a full range of issues. This would be arms race, nuclear proliferation, Iran, climate change, and so on and so forth. So at the time, President Russian said, I'll think about it. So came this meeting. So this meeting is a continuation of the agenda that was suggested by President Biden. So behind the scene, there are a number of range issues, all designed to discuss the strategic depth of each party, particularly the expansion of NATO. Now, Ukraine happens to be the reason for this meeting because of what's happening in the Ukraine. But the Russians are very clear. We are not going to negotiate the expansion of NATO, and they want some guarantees. One of the guarantees to make sure that the Ukraine will not have any NATO presence. So for the American side, it's trying to rally or to find an alternative, as President Biden has suggested, an alternative to this demand.
Dr. Hamoud.
Now, that's what behind the scene. In terms of the video, it's public show, and we'll continue to see the negotiations moving forward at different levels. The Ukraine officials are visiting Europe, UK, and so on and so forth.
Dr. Hamoud Salhi, I'm sorry to cut your train of thoughts, but is it suitable to say we are almost on the brink of another Cold War between these two superpowers, and in general between the West and the East, since even China and the US have some escalation over Taiwan? And can this be escalated to a real war in the future?
The Cold War is really a misleading concept because it assumes that there is a hot war, and it's as if you put yourself in a bathtub and you have, instead of water, you have fuel, and you have a match. So the Cold War is that if you put the match down, you are going to destroy yourself and destroy everything. The Cold War mentality was built on deterrence. What we've seen these days is a change of competition. For example, when you look at the Biden strategy, national strategy, they use terms that are not of the Cold Era. For example, it refers to China and Russia as competitors. To China, for example, it also refers to as an assertive international competitors. To the Russian is destabilizing country. And it means it has an effect on their strategy. What the Americans are looking from the Russians, and what they always wanted, is to have a predictable and a stable strategy, which the Russians don't want to do that for obvious reason. So the terms Cold War is misleading on another level, that today technology, cybersecurity, the world is interconnected. The whole idea of deterrence through military means is no longer viable. Today, the countries are so interconnected. So what you see heightened tensions between countries and lobbying and game planning and using the main thing as their tool is either cybersecurity, espionage, and so on and so forth, or sanctions. And this latest decision, this latest crisis tells us that when the United States threatened the Russian of severe consequences, remember that since Biden took over in January, the Americans have put 17 type of sanctions against the Russians. So even that sanction regime that
thank you so much for
the
all
Americans
this
are talking about is difficult to achieve.
Dr. Hamoud Salhi, thank you so much for this clarification. The lack of time, otherwise we will always stay here. Joined us live from California, USA. Thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And to put the case on the floor of discussion, joining me live on L24 News Studios, our fellow journalist Hassan Brakan, who is specialized precisely in this file. Hassan, hello and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Pleasure always. Hassan, you have made a lot and so many reports over this situation between Ukraine and US and all the countries in the Middle East as well as in the South. Now, let me say, previously we witnessed the Cold War between Russia as well as US. Now, there is another Cold War. Can we call it like this?
Yeah, I don't know if we can call it a Cold War. Just the professor said that it's going to be a very misleading concept. It's a concept that he used to use before, but currently I think that the situation is a little bit different. Talking about the relation between the West and Russia and what's going on currently, I think that the relation between Russia and the West has always been very difficult, taking into consideration the history between the two sides. And currently, the escalation of tension between Russia and Ukraine, this is the center of our research. This is the center of the reports that I've been making so far. You know that, Abdurrahim, we need to take into consideration the historical facts and some really important historical facts between the relation between Russia and Ukraine, and also Russia and the West, because Russia does not accept a US-led international order where Russia is marginalized and Russia is not considered as a major power. This is not acceptable by the Kremlin. And the historical fact or the perspective of Russia of this conflict is that Russia is considering Ukraine as a very important part of it. It's part of Ukraine historically, culturally, and economically. If we can mention some examples, Ukraine has always been part of the sphere of influence of Russia. Ukraine, in the period of Soviet Union, had the biggest part of the nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union back in that time. Yeah, so it's really considered as really important. Even Ukraine culturally lean more to Russia more than the West. and this is really important. We should really highlight this. Also, let me just finish this idea, Abdurrahim, which is the expansion of NATO, as the professor just mentioned, because this is what started all this problem, because NATO in 2004 managed to get 7 countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. They joined NATO. Can you imagine this? And there are a lot of countries from the Soviet Union who joined the European Union, and Russia has taken this as a threat, considered this as a threat and as a red line. And this is why in the last 10 years, Russia responded to this.
I'm sorry to cut your train of thought. I really like this idiomatic. But if I keep you reading, you will never stop because you master the topic. Now, this is what you have talked. What I can depict from your words, this is a Russian perspective from the Russian angle.
Exactly.
Now, into consideration, on the other hand, we do have the U.S. perspective, the Western world, how they depict this topic.
So there was the Russian perspective of the conflict. For the West, they really consider Ukraine as very, very important for their interests, for their agenda, and for their geopolitical goals. The United States, Europe, NATO consider Ukraine really important. We can give some example. The United States spend more than $500 million as aids to Ukraine, as military aid and security aids to Ukraine. $500 million. When it comes to NATO, NATO is training and conducting military training with Ukraine on a regular basis and providing it with the latest technological and military advances technologies. And this is really important. As a matter of fact, the West considers Ukraine as a barrier state between them and Russia.
Hassan, into consideration, if we take the online video has been started already between Putin and Biden, US president, maybe there will be another escalation?
Yeah, I think in international relations, in our academic life, we consider that communication as a positive sign. Always when the channels of communication are open, we consider this as a good sign. And I think that starting the dialogue, I suppose, and there are a lot of analysts are predicting that both sides are going to lean more toward de-escalation. Of course, Russia is going to negotiate, as the professor just mentioned, is going to negotiate NATO not expanding more and taking leverage. And as I mentioned, NATO already has taken over a lot of countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. Also, I think that I think that Russia is going to negotiate a legally binding deal that NATO is going to not going to expand, and also that they are not going to intervene in the Donbas region because it's really important region to Russia. Beside like lifting sanctions, of course.
Hamza, there is the point of China as well as on Taiwan and US, but the lack of time, I've been asked to keep moving on our news because we don't have a lot of time, so we keep it to another one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure.
Yeah.
With the growing tension between Russia and Ukraine, the EU and the US are considering high-hitting sanctions on the Russian economy if Moscow orders an invasion of Ukraine. In recent weeks, multiple American media organizations have suggested that Russia is planning a military incursion into Ukraine.
Ukraine has accused Russia of massing tens of thousands of troops near its border, raising the prospect of open war between the two neighbors. Ukraine's President Zelensky said his armed forces were capable of fighting off any Russian attack, as the country marked its National Army Day with a display of US armored vehicles and patrol boats. US President Joe Biden has vowed his unwavering support to Ukraine in its standoff with Moscow and will hold talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin to try to resolve the crisis. According to media sources, if Moscow orders an invasion of Ukraine, the EU and US would consider hard-hitting sanctions targeting major Russian banks, as well as Russian Direct Investment Fund, Moscow's Sovereign Wealth Fund, and may also attempt to make it harder for investors to buy Russian debt on the secondary market. As stated in media sources, American officials are even discussing disconnecting the country from the SWIFT banking network. This would be by far the strongest sanction ever placed on Russia and would significantly affect the lives of ordinary citizens. Russia, on its behalf, ridiculed the report and suggested that it is being hyped up through the media, denying any intention to invade Ukraine. The Kremlin said that any troop movements are an internal matter and of no concern to any other country.
For COVID situation updates around the world, let's follow this report by Usama Ayadi.
COVID-19 situation and measures taken in the world vary from a country to another, especially that the new variant of coronavirus Omicron is suspected to spur a new wave that people are likely to face soon. According to World Health Organization, most cases in Europe at the moment are among children between 5 and 14 years old. As stated by Hans Klug, the WHO's European director, on Tuesday, COVID-19 was 2 to 3 times among children than in adults. New restrictions were imposed on citizens in the French Caribbean island Martinique. The case rate surge led officials at the island to order a new curfew on Tuesday as a precaution measure against the virus rapidly spreading in the region. Rate of deaths in Germany reached record levels. The reported number of deaths on Wednesday reached 69,601, surpassing that of last February. These last scary numbers made experts question whether Germany has already passed the peak of the fourth wave of the pandemic. The last restrictions of Hong Kong's officials concerning the pandemic spread have been criticized after imposing up to 21 days of quarantine on arrivals to the country. These measures are seen to discourage visitors as well as businessmen, as the bustler cosmopolitan business hub is risking to lose its shine. A disaster has taken place in Nigeria that will cause a medical uproar, as up to 1 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccine expired without being used. This might be one of the biggest vaccine losses that show how Africans are struggling to get the shots against the virus, which is in a continual surge. Long lines snaked around testing stations show how dangerous the situation has become in the South Korean capital, Seoul. The case rate in the country exceeded 7,000 cases for the first time since the beginning of the pandemic. Death rates in the country surpassed 4,000, and in response to the long-time criticism of experts, the government started new restrictions on Monday.
The United States slapped sanctions on a number of officials from several countries, including Iran, Syria and Uganda, as part of claims of human rights violation and repressive actions. Islam Sidon, what follow?
The United States has blacklisted individuals and entities in Iran, Syria and Uganda and imposed actions accusing them of being connected to serious human rights abuses and repressive acts. During the week of the United States Summit for Democracy, the Treasury Department has declared that it was targeting suppression and the weakening of democracy. Washington barred 2 senior Syrian Air Force officers and other 3 in Syria's security intelligence apparatus of being responsible for biological weapon attacks on civilians. Uganda's Chief of Military Intelligence Major General Abel Kandiyo was also blacklisted due to human rights abuses committed under his watch. The latter was disappointed by the verdict. Iran, on the other hand, was convicted by the US to be part of the accused entities in which major officials were blacklisted, including the special units of Iran's law enforcement forces and counter-terror special forces, as well as several of their officials.
Even amid Vienna talks, US cannot stop imposing sanctions against Iran. Washington fails to understand that maximum failure and a diplomatic breakthrough are mutually exclusive. Doubling down on sanctions won't create leverage and is anything but seriousness and goodwill.
Iran has slammed the United States for imposing new sanctions just days before the talks to resurrect the 2015 Iran nuclear deal resume in Vienna.
Australian government follows the same stream of the United States and New Zealand in boycotting the next Olympic Games that will be held next February 2022 in China, claiming that the Chinese government has refused to sit for talks with world powers of anti-humanitarian acts that Beijing is committing on its territories on Uyghurs group. Ayadi Usama clarified.
China's Winter Olympics are likely to be -3 countries on diplomacy level, as US and New Zealand announced their diplomatic boycott to the 2022 Olympic Games that will be held in China.
The Biden administration will not send any diplomatic or official representation to the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics and Paralympic Games, given the PRC's ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang and other human rights abuses. The athletes on Team USA have our full support. We will be behind them 100% as we cheer them on from home, but we will not be
Today's declaration of Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison of boycotting the next February Olympics in China argued that the latter is unwilling to talk over human rights abuse conducted against Uyghurs.
The Australian government will not be sending any official representatives to the forthcoming Winter Games.
Australian Olympics Committee said the boycott will not have any effect on its athletes who are preparing to participate in the game. China on its part imposed punitive measures against Australian goods in the Chinese market, which triggered Australia's Morrison to object these measures. As a part of joining this boycott campaign, British Prime Minister's spokesman announced that his country is yet to take a final decision over whether his country will take the same stream as Australia, the USA and New Zealand. For their part, New Zealand officials stated that their government is unwilling to sit the next pandemic talks with the Chinese government as a reaction to the Chinese officials' acts.
So we've already made clear that we won't be represented there at a ministerial level. We made that clear to China, I think, in October. And so for us, that's a decision we've already made. Range of factors, but mostly to do with COVID and the fact that the logistics of travel and so on around COVID are not conducive to that kind of.
Thousands of displaced Afghans were unable to flee the Taliban following the fall of Kabul because the British government's response to the crisis was disorganized and slow. The German government has reached its renewal time as this week the new designated incoming Chancellor Olaf Scholz presented the list of the government he will head for the next period. Olaf Scholz paved the way for chancellery in Germany as a successor of the 16-year Chancellor Angela Merkel. Nabil Khazini on what follow.
A new three-way coalition government in Germany has appeared when Germany's environmentalist Greens approved the coalition agreement with the center-left Social Democratic Party (SPD) and the pro-business Free Democrats Party (FDP).
The big task of our political generation will be to resolve the tension between ecological questions and economic necessities. This dominates the whole coalition agreement and will be besides all other crises.
The Greens said that 86% of about 71,000 members who voted backed the accord. The SPD and the FPD each approved the alliance at special party meetings over the weekend where support exceeded 90%. Olaf Scholz called the political transition a morning for a new start. Germany's next Chancellor Olaf Scholz has presented his 7 ministerial picks for the new coalition government, with the outgoing Justice Minister Christine Lambrecht becoming the new Defense Minister. Olaf Scholz said security will be in the hands of strong women in his government. The Free Democrats leader Christian Lindner will become Finance Minister and effectively the number 3 official in the new government.
We said that we want to venture more progress, and from this week on, we want to work on progress. We have no illusions. We face great challenges.
Karl Lauterbach, a Harvard professor and a regular guest on TV talk shows, is seen as one of Germany's most trusted pandemic experts. He is expected to put his expertise to fight the current sanitary crisis Germany is facing.
We have to fight this pandemic. The pandemic will last longer than many people think, but we will manage it. The vaccination will play a central role, but not the only role. In addition to that, we will strengthen the health system. An important aim must be to bring the cases number down so far that we can recommend the travel without endangering people. We will put emphasis on that, a great emphasis.
Scholz is due to be elected as Chancellor in Parliament on Wednesday, ending the 16-year tenure of outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel. The new government will replace the grand coalition of the Conservative Christian Democratic Union and the SPD, the two largest party blocs in parliament, who have dominated German politics since the end of World War II.
A senior European Union official said that talks on reviving the 2015 Iran nuclear deal will resume on Thursday in Vienna. France's foreign minister has said on Wednesday that the talks were likely to continue, although he added that he feared Iran was playing for time. India's top military official has died today when an Indian Air Force helicopter carrying 14 people crashed in southern India. Only one passenger survived. Chief of Defense Staff General Bipin Rawat died along with his wife. The cause of the crash and details on the other passengers are not yet known. Former Chief of Army Staff Rawat was appointed India's Chief of Defense Staff in December 2019. Asia, the first continent to be affected by COVID-19 2 years ago, challenges are now mounting for Asian countries after measures to combat the virus has been affecting the Asian countries' economy. More with Nabil Khazini.
Countries in Asia were among the first globally to be affected by COVID-19, and thus the first to start initiatives and reducing cases of ensuring long-term preparedness in the fight against the pandemic. Thailand, a country that relies on tourism for its economy, has taken its policy a step further by allowing many travelers come in the country. From early November, the country received travelers who meet basic conditions. Fully vaccinated people from 63 countries and territories who test negative upon arrival can roam Thailand without quarantine. Hong Kong has been relying on strict immigration and quarantine rules to keep itself isolated from the pandemic. Yet, economic pressures are now mounting for the territory to open its borders, and the government says its main priority is mainland China. China's zero-COVID strategy geared to prevent and contain transmission of COVID-19 domestically and from abroad. China's zero-COVID strategy relies on a rigorous system of quarantine, testing and isolation of positive cases, as well as community lockdown and travel restrictions to mitigate viral spread. The approach has been wildly successful from a public health perspective. Malaysia and China agreed to boost bilateral cooperation in developing COVID-19 vaccines and drugs. Saifuddin Abdullah, Malaysian foreign minister, praised China's leading role in the global fight against the pandemic. China is determined to succeed in hosting the Winter Olympic Games at a time when a new COVID-19 variant, Omicron, has been detected in many countries. Officials are confident China can reach the objective, a challenge that would be a decisive propaganda win for Beijing's zero-tolerance COVID strategy.
Protesters organized a sit in front of High Electoral Commission building in Libya in the capital Tripoli to express their rejection of the ongoing electoral process and demand that it would be postponed until a public vote on the constitution is held. The details with Zahra Furjani.
The headquarters of the Libyan Commission was stormed in the capital Tripoli by citizens who described themselves as Tripoli revolutionaries. Protesters set up their tents in the districts of the Commission's headquarters until the presidential elections are held only after the approval of the draft constitution. The High Electoral Commission's vice president, who denied the protesters' arrival at the Commission building, indicated that such development would potentially obstruct the elections. Meanwhile, the High Electoral Commission is preparing to announce the final list of presidential candidates. At the same time, the controversy continues over the electoral process after more than 70 deputies in House of Representatives demanded to hold the head of the Commission accountable before announcing the final list of candidates, claiming that negative developments characterize the electoral process and the failure to implement the law. In light of this tense situation, Libyan political circles and even international forces have begun to push for the option of delaying until a general consensus is reached between the parties at issue in Libya. This consensus ensures that everyone recognizes the results of the electoral process.
And for more world news, let's follow this roundup by Islam Seed and Nadia Kasmi.
The US Senate rejected a resolution on Tuesday that would have prohibited the proposed sale of advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, missile launchers and other weapons and support to Saudi Arabia. The vote was 67-30 against the resolution, which was introduced by Republicans Rand Paul and Mike Lee, as well as Bernie Sanders, who co-caucuses with Democrats. While many U.S. lawmakers consider Saudi Arabia an important partner in the Middle East, members of Congress also have criticized the country for its involvement in the war in Yemen, a conflict considered one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters.
After suspension of its membership in 2012 from the Arab League, Syria is likely to be reinstated in the next summit that will be hosted by Algeria. The readmission of Syria will be the result of Egyptian efforts, as its strategic borders lay on the northern borders of Syria. This readmission will guarantee a certain balance of power in the Arab League, as well as the Arab world, as Egyptian officials stated that their country is open to this readmission.
Filippo Grandi, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, told the UN Security Council that conflict, climate change and COVID-19 have created a perfect mix of challenges facing refugees, displaced people and their hosts. He drew attention to the 39 million people living in Afghanistan. 23 million are facing extreme levels of hunger, while 3.5 million have been displaced by conflict, 700,000 this year alone. Mr. Grandi warned that humanitarian efforts are paralyzed by conflicting political agendas, saying that the politicization of humanitarian and refugee work is another form of failure.
The UN refugee chief Filippo Grandi also warned the UN Security Council about the growing inability of the international community to restore peace in the countries like Yemen, Libya and Ethiopia, which is forcing humanitarian and refugee organizations to work increasingly during conflicts that they can't solve despite the expectations of many people caught up in these crises. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees said his office and other organizations are dealing with about 84 million refugees who fled across borders and people displaced within their own countries, trying to provide humanitarian support, shelter and safety. A Malaysian appeals court today, Wednesday, upheld former Prime Minister Najib Razak's guilty verdict in a case linked to a corruption scandal. Najib was sentenced to 12 years in prison and fined $50 million last year by a high court after being found guilty for criminal breach of trust, abuse of power, and money laundering for illegally receiving about $10 million from SRC International.
As a continuation for its persecution to the Palestinians, the Zionist occupation announced the completion of a sensor-equipped underground wall on the side of Gaza. The Zionist defense minister said the technologically advanced project includes hundreds of cameras, radar and other sensors over a stretch of 65 kilometers. Plans for the barrier were first announced in 2016 as a countermeasure developed after Hamas resistance group used tunnels to blindside its troops in a 2014 war.
One of the suspects of killing the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi has been arrested on Tuesday in France by French police acting to a Turkish warrant. The arrested man, named Khalid Al-Utaibi, was about to board the plane from Paris to Riyadh after identifying the identity of the suspect. In the other part, Saudi officials announced that the arrested Saudi national was mistaken, and investigators in the case are still working on confirming the identity of the suspect.
To sport now, the UEFA Champions League witnessed the last round yesterday with the brace of Kylian Mbappé and Lionel Messi. Let's follow this report.
Liverpool made the perfect 6 Champions League wins, from 6 on Tuesday with 2-1 victory at AC Milan, which knocked one of Europe's most storied club out of the Champions League. Fikayo Tomori had given Milan hope they could make the last 60th with his tap-in just before the half-hour mark at the San Siro. But a quick reply from Mohamed Salah and Divock Origi's note finished 10 minutes after the break. In short, Jurgen Klopp's side finished Group B on 18 points. Kylian Mbappé and Lionel Messi both scored twice as the Paris Saint-Germain rounded out their Champions League group stage, camping with a 4-1 thumping of Club Brugge on Tuesday. Mbappé scored twice in the first 7 minutes, the second fastest burst at the start of the game in Champions League history, before setting up Messi to make it 3-0 at halftime. Atletico Madrid grabbed a place in the 60th of the Champions League as Antoine Griezmann scored 1 goal and had a key role in 2 others as the Spanish side beat Porto 3-1. The win in northern Porto, coupled with AC Milan's 2-1 defeat to a second-string Liverpool side at San Siro, was enough to send Diego Simeone's side through as the second-place team in the Group B, despite starting the day bottom.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. That's all what we have for now. See you. Bye-bye. Good night.